this monk was talking about how like the more advanced you are, the more you understand uncertainty, the more you realize uncertainty. So like if you're like pretty good in your practice, then you're like okay with uncertainty. If you're more advanced, then you're even better. You're not really phased by much. But then at the highest level, everything is uncertain.
That's really interesting. It's kind of like it makes me think of two things, which is the old cliche, but it's a truism, even though it's a cliche, which is like the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. The more you know, the more mysterious things become. Um, and then the other one was this amazing quote I just heard that's attributed to uh, Einstein, which is that according to Einstein, there are, I hope I get this right. Anyway, this is close enough. There are like four types of intelligence. There's smart, there's very smart, there's genius, and there's simple.
So simple is the highest.
Simple is the highest.
Yeah.
Simple is
Yeah.
the highest. If you
That's
can reach to the point of simplicity, if you can get to that place, then that's the highest level, which is kind of like funny with it. It's counterintuitive, and it's kind of counterintuitive with what the monk was saying in that, you think that if you're meditating and you're becoming enlightened or whatever that means to begin with, um, then you are gaining more certainty because a door kind of opens up in your mind that allows you to perceive the universe in some kind of organized and systematic way. But in fact, the complete opposite happens. The more you go down that path, the more uncertain you realize things are, and the more okay you are with it. It's not panic inducing. You don't have that neurotic uh, reflex to try to pin everything down and make everything understandable.
Nareem Karoli Baba, the guru of Ram Dass, would say as the highest compliment that he's a simple man. He's a simple person.
I love that.
So
So
you've
he's like
been,
Einstein, you see? He
yeah,
and Einstein, you have the two polarities, but it's interesting because Einstein, when you read about that guy, not that I've read too much, but a little bit, uh, he was like a deeply like spiritual, very kind of mystical thinker. He kind of got past the rational and at the far ends of his contemplation of the universe. It wasn't really about numbers anymore. He was a deep believer in kind of in God, and maybe not the God of the scriptures, but in a God,
yeah,
uh, the 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 force that mysteriously creates the universe, and administers all of its laws. So it's kind of funny how those two poles kind of come back around and join somewhere.
absolutely, yeah. And I feel like most of us are somewhere. Oh, the rest of us are somewhere in between, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're somewhere
Yeah,
on the roller coaster.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And on the karmic, the cycle, whatever what do they call it, samsara? You
We're
know,
we're we're just trying not to fall off when it goes over those hills. We're like, I don't know, some of us are strapped in a little better than
yeah,
others. The
yeah.
cars.
On the cosmic hamster wheel, right?
Yeah, right.
Going
That's it.
around and around. Tell me a bit about the residency you're doing right now.
I'm doing a residency at the Ace Hotel, um, which is wonderful because I became a father 3 years ago, and one of my central projects is traveling to various hotels around the country, around the world, and making site-specific installations using whatever furniture and objects I find in the hotels that I stay in, and then photographing them and putting the room back in its original condition. And obviously, becoming a father has completely uh, prevented me from from pursuing that line of work because travel with leaving a newborn or even a toddler behind for any length of time is not an option. Um, so this residency came across. My wife actually is the one that learned about it, and she forwarded me the link, and I applied right away because the Brooklyn location is located about a 20-minute walk from where we live. And they do I guess uh 4 or 5 artists a year in the Brooklyn location, but then they have the residency program throughout various hotels around the world. Um, and they had a slot open, the very last slot open, which I applied for, and I instantly wrote them and was like, I am the perfect person to be a part of this residency. Like, not only is my work about hotels and rooms and about the whole experience of being displaced and being in a hotel, but I live 20 minutes away. I'm not able to make this work right now for the reasons that I mentioned. And so this would be amazing if I could do this. And they accepted me. And so now I have a room for an entire month to make work in. And it's been I'm uh here right now and I'm almost exactly at the halfway point. I'm one day past the halfway point of the residency.
So you've been working in hotels for a number of years now.
A little over 10 years. Yeah, I think I'm in my 11th year of making this work.
How did that start? Maybe you could describe a little bit about the sort of the background of this series. Would you call it a series, or maybe just a way of working the process, and what the process is?
Sure. Yeah, for me, I think it absolutely is a series, and I like to think of the kind of practice that I have as series centric. That could be a term. It really started with me buying a very nice full frame DSLR camera in order to document my own work about 12 years ago or so. And I had sold a drawing, which gave me the funds to do this. And I thought, okay, I'll get a really nice camera and I'll have these wonderful images that then I can use to promote my work and create a website, all the rest of it. But unexpectedly, uh, the quality of these images was so inspiring that it kind of sent me off on a tangent to want to make standalone photographs because it was so wonderful having this new tool to play with. Yeah. So I sold a drawing. And I specifically, it was a drawing that I wasn't planning on selling. I mean, it's funny how your life is kind of determined to a large extent, is more determined by chance than by active agency. I wasn't planning on selling this drawing, but I needed a camera to photograph my work. And so I sold the drawing, I got the camera. Camera turned out to be like incredible and inspired me to make standalone photographic work. Not as something that I wanted to exhibit, but just as another form of expression. It was just so fun to go out there and shoot and have the images look beautiful. And then I found myself in Basel, Switzerland, working as an art handler for the art fair that happens there annually. And I was in a very weird kind of mid-century modern apartment that I had rented with the other art handlers for the 12 days that we were there. And it was filled with this beautiful uh, kind of mid-century modern furniture. And I just started arranging it and making these weird kind of furniture sculptures just because I didn't have anything to do and I was away from the studio and I needed a creative outlet. And I brought those images home and printed them out. And they were these black and white 16 by 20 prints. And they uh, turned out to be a lot more compelling as standalone works than the other art that I was making at the time, which I found surprising and both exciting and kind of and kind of sad. I was like, oh, I wasn't planning to have this, kind of edge its way into the center of my practice, but it's kind of elbowing its way in. And so I that kind of was the genesis of the series. And since then, it's taken a life of its own. And I went from the series being something that I did only when I happened to be traveling. And at that point, I was doing quite a lot of traveling because I was kind of on the art handler circuit, going to different fairs, and I was in different parts of the world and the country. So only when I happened to be traveling and staying in hotels, I would make this work. And then as the work progressed and the installations became more ambitious, um, I started traveling specifically to make the work.
So before you were doing photography, you were making paintings and drawings, right?
I was, yeah,
So was that what you had? You were trained as a painter?
exactly. And I went to school for that and received my BFA uh, specifically in painting.
So before you got the camera, you were still painting.
I was, yeah. Yeah, painting, kind of focusing a little more on drawing, but also painting.
Have you continued your painting and drawing practice since taking up photography?
I really had a bit of a moment of crisis, which was, I think, more like ego identity crisis, because as the photography became more central to my interest and to my creativity, um, the the painting practice really started to diminish, which was nerve-wracking because I'd always identified myself as a painter, and I really um, aspired to be a part of that lineage in the most romantic terms imaginable. Since I was very young, I wanted to be, you know, um, a painter's painter, whatever that means. And so have kind of letting that go required a lot of what I've come to term as ego plasticity, you know.
That's good.
Uh, but it's like I eventually I got over it, and I felt like I'd kind of come to a dead end with painting. I felt that I was, um, without meaning to, I was using my painting as in such a competitive way, and there was so much ambition and competition and uh, pressure to achieve a certain kind of way of being in the world, all associated around this act of painting, that it was starting to stifle me creatively. Um, and the stakes had gotten so high, in my own mind, and I think part of that is just living in the city and being surrounded by it and being surrounded by art as a career, and thinking about it in these elevated terms, which kind of takes you away from, the purity of your initial connection to it. And what was nice about photography is that for me, it didn't have any of those things. I wasn't trained as a photographer. I didn't go to school for photography. I wasn't aware of the history or the lineage of it as a practice, so I didn't feel like I had to live up to anything or be in competition with anyone or make my work look like anything. Otherwise, it would be judged one way or another. It was just it kind of took me back to a kind of a pure creative exploration of the medium, and that was very refreshing. And I think as a result, I just over time just kind of gave up painting and drawing for probably a good 7, 8 years. I just kind of almost completely stopped and just did photographic work.
So you felt more free in your practice with photography, that you didn't have this sort of baggage, the background. It seems like you've incorporated, I'm just looking through your book, Room for the Night, which is just a beautiful book. I love that you talk about your sort of background, the sort of motivations behind the work. Maybe you could talk about a little bit about coming from another country and how the hotel room has sort of informed your work, your ideas, I should say.
Sure, it's funny because as really working on that book and sort of being forced to write the introduction. I mean, not forced, I didn't have to write an introduction, but I thought it would be important. Um, uh, Really revealed so much more about the project than I was expecting. And at first I started to write this very academic introduction that just sounded very wooden and analytic. And after about a year of working on that, I kind of threw it away. And I thought, I just have to really talk from the heart. And I realized through that process that um, hotels were very seminal in my experience of being in America. I immigrated from Russia with my family at the age of 8, and the first night that we spent in America, we spent in a hotel room not far from the airport. And it was such a strange experience because we had been, or I had been told by my parents that America was this wonderful land of opportunity and that it was all roses, butterflies, and sunshine when we would get there. And we arrived in the middle of the night and went straight to the hotel. And so I woke up in the morning in this like dingy, dark little motel room in like a roadside motel. It was like all brown and the furniture was ugly and it was just packed with our suitcases. And I thought, what the hell happened? How do we go from Russia to this, you know? So, um, so it made me realize that um, hotels were there from the very beginning. You know, this idea of displacement, of going from one culture to another, and of having the hotel as a kind of intermediary, um, has always been part of my experience.
You describe it as a portal between worlds.
Yes,
You're really investigating all these sort of deeper qualities of what the hotel means in the culture, what it means for you. There's a kind of a tension in the work. I wonder, did you discover a lot of this stuff as you were sort of doing the book? Were you sort of figuring it out more conceptually? Like, I know that you want to have like a conceptual, not necessarily a narrative, but like some sort of conceptual framework. Do you have that like when you're composing an image or for the greater project as a whole, or how do you think about that?
you know, it's all happened gradually. You know, I think the first impetus for the work was just being playful, you know, was it was playfulness that was brought about by the boredom of being away from the studio and being in a foreign country, being kind of stuck in this Airbnb or whatever it was, and wanting to do something creative. And all of the kind of conceptual understanding and framing around the project, I think, came gradually after the fact as I kind of unpacked my motivations and thought more deeply about what the hotel represents, you know, socially, culturally, historically in America. Personally, for me, all of these things sort of started to weave together, um, which also in itself became an interesting lesson in the way creativity works. You know, that oftentimes it does start with something, a motivation that on its surface seems kind of mundane, maybe even banal. And then as you work, it gains steam. You know, I always think about like Monet and his haystacks and how, you know, if you tell someone, oh, there's like this guy and he made 30 paintings and say, oh, what did he paint? "Oh, he painted haystacks. Oh, he painted haystacks. Oh, it's, you know, it sounds like the most banal subject matter for a body of work imaginable.
There's something playful which I think is really important to have that. And in your work, I think there's a connection to this playfulness, which is really important. Like you mentioned that it started from that place of just sort of playing around.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And you know, that's always been so important to me, having the connection to playfulness and improvisation and humor. Um, Not necessarily that that is the end all be all, but I think it's such a good place um, from which to begin, um, because you kind of, you know, you're lowering the stakes. And oftentimes the playful side of our personality is like the most honest in some way, you know?
Yeah.
Because in order to be playful, you kind of have to return to a kind of like a childlike place, which is free of judgment and is just self-indulgent. Um,
Yeah, and it's like it's not really important that you know all this stuff in the moment. Yeah, I mean, you don't need to know, right? You just need to just have fun, right? And then all the stuff sort of becomes revealed later.
That's that's it exactly. Yeah, you don't, in fact, knowing is, sometimes it's a hindrance. Sometimes it gets in the way. Your own authorship um, can be uh, it, it can be deadening. Your need to be author and authoritarian have the same root for a reason, you know?
Yeah.
And we're so obsessed with being authors of our own work, and that's great. There's a time that comes for that. There's a point at which you start refining, you know. But at the beginning, it's nice to let go of that a little bit and just to be in a state of just pure wonder and
Yeah.
playfulness.
Yeah. That reminds me of a review I read for the Show Foundation, which said that it buckles under its own weight.
Mhm.
And I was like, okay, you could have everything. You could have all the great, the biggest production, throw all the money at it. But if it's not playful, if it's not fun, if the creative spirit isn't there, then you're lacking the real core of the thing, right?
Yeah, it's interesting how that is, because I think um, we all have so much internal pressure to be sophisticated, in the art world, to make work that will be sophisticated. I mean, the the thing that is the most terrifying to anyone is to make work that people will look at and will think is trite, will think is tacky, um, whatever those terms are, that are used as like cudgels to critically destroy art that we don't think is good enough. And so we all want to be good enough to impress, and and in an odd way that can get in the way.
But it's all contextual, right? It's all operating within a cultural context. It's funny how stuff like, for example, I believe it was Vivaldi that was basically obscure for hundreds of years, a long time. Like nobody knew or cared about him for a long time, and then he came back into fashion. So like these sort of trends come and go, but if you have the right sort of approach, the right mindset, the right sort of the freedom of spirit, then you can't and just trust in the process, then you can't lose.
Yeah, I was recently reading something about Basquiat, and he was talking about something about how the word decorative uh, was such a negative word for used during his time to describe bad art. And he kind of hated that word, and he thought it was ridiculous that people used it so much to say that, just to dismiss art that wasn't good, call it decorative.
Like it's shallow. There's nothing behind it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, this is decorative art. And I think that makes sense because, this is sort of you're looking at the tail end of sort of abstract expressionism and minimalism maybe, and pop art. And so something that's decorative, ooh, it's so shallow. Um, when I was fresh out of school, the word that was being bandied around was precious. If your art was called precious, or if you wanted to make a statement about how horrible something was, you say, it's very precious. It's making very precious paintings. Um, and these words just they're so kind of stupid and meaningless. I mean, I kind of understand what people say by that, but at the same time, it's like, you know, I I can't think of anything more precious, but also more beautiful than, an Islamic miniature, or
Or Vermeer or something.
a Vermeer, or an illustrated book of hours, you
Yeah.
know, those old illuminated manuscripts.
Oh man.
Just incredible, so precious. But who cares, So decorative, right? Like you think of like some of those beautiful carpets from Persia, so decorative. Who cares? Precious. Who cares? Um, I was listening to an interview with Walton Ford, and he was talking about how he has received a lot of criticism for being illustrative, being overly illustrative. And then he made the comment that, well, if you look at the Renaissance, like that's 200 years of artists essentially illustrating the Bible, right? So illustrative, who cares? It's not, these words ultimately they're they're meaningless. Um, I think.
I think it also wants to say that there's a certain type of something, that everything is like something else. Like we always want to make analogies to another thing. It's very difficult for people to look at something without comparing it, right? So you look at something and you say, "Oh, this kind of reminds me of that. It must be like that."
Mm.
But it's, I think, just to sort of just to appreciate anything, or people too. You look at somebody, we all make these judgments that are often inaccurate. I think we're very, very poor. We've shown ourselves to be repeatedly very poor judges of character with people, and probably the same with art too.
Yeah, you're so right. And then we internalize that stuff and we say, okay, precious bad, illustrative bad, decorative bad. And so when I make my work, I don't want to be criticized as precious, illustrative, decorative. So whatever my natural inclinations are, if they uh, touch upon those three concepts, however they've been formed in our mind as part of the cultural convention that we are a part of, I have to stay away from it. That's kind of like the danger zone. And then you're not really being authentic to yourself. You're just trying to make work that you think is sophisticated. And I think that's maybe part of why I had to push the pause button on the paintings that I was doing, because I think I'd kind of fallen into that trap. I was making work. I was trying to make a certain kind of work to make a certain kind of impression rather than working from the heart.
So then when you started this series with the hotel, with basically, so the process is maybe you could talk a little about the process itself on a physical level.
Well, the idea is to uh, make site-specific installations within the rooms that I occupy using only whatever furniture, architecture, and other objects that I find in the rooms. And so it's really an improvisational process that's also durational because it only lasts for as long as I occupy the room, and typically that's only a day or two. In this case, I'm for the residency, I'm quite lucky because I'm here for an entire month. So it's actually altered the parameters of my usual working process. But typically I'm in a hotel for a night, maybe two or three, also depending how much money I have. Um, and so it's the work is done in secret. The hotels aren't aware um, of what I'm doing. Um, I make the sculptures, the arrangements. I photograph them in kind of a straight ahead style, almost like reminiscent of crime scene photography. Um, and then I return the room to its original condition. And when I leave, I try to really make it so that nobody that comes after me will have any idea of what I did before they got there.
So how important is it that everything is done in real life? There's no photoshopping going on in the final, like in the images themselves. When you construct the scene.
That's pretty crucial. Um, and not just no photoshopping, but people often ask me because balance is a part of the work. And sometimes the balancing can look very precarious or almost impossible to imagine. And so people will ask, like, oh, do you use like tape to hold things together, or glue or anything like that? Or do you have assistants that kind of prop things up? And it's really important for me that the project is something that I do alone, so that part of the meaning of the work is like, what can one person do when left to their own devices in a room? It's not a crew of art handlers that are moving this stuff. It's like, what can I physically accomplish on my own as an individual? There's no, props. There's no like tape or glue. So it's like, what can I do with just the elements that are provided for me? Um, and obviously not photoshopping it afterwards. I don't want to create, sort of fantastical, uh, impossible, um, kind of fantasy worlds that are digitally manipulated. I want them to look fantastical in a certain sense because I'd like to get out of the homogeny that most of these spaces kind of have. And I want to create something kind of surreal and otherworldly and uncanny, but I want that to be created naturally, um, within within the parameters of what I'm given.
Do you think that having these parameters and having these limitations leads to sort of more creative ideas? Often it seems like when you have limited options, it leads to more creative possibilities in some ways.
I think so. It's a double-edged sword because, rules are important because if you don't have rules to your playfulness, then it's just sort of chaos. Like a game only exists because there are rules that frame uh frame its options, Otherwise, limited optionality becomes kind of a pointless thing. Um, but at the same time, it is a double-edged sword because rules can become sclerotic. I think that's the way you say that word, sclerotic. Sclerotic.
No, what's the
What's
word?
the sclerotic from the word sclerosis? Sclerotic, not sclerotic. Anyway, rules can become sclerotic um, in um, that there um, isn't time and place in which they go from giving you freedom to becoming authoritarian constraints that actually lock you into a way of working and prevent you from thinking outside of the boxes that you've now created for yourself.
So there's a sweet spot.
I think there's a sweet spot, and I think there's a point at which um, you have to be able to jettison the rules that you've created once they've outlived their usefulness.
Hmm.
And so everything has that kind of ebb and flow where you go um, from creativity to entropy, and it's like this cycle, you know. And so when you start to realize that, all right, this way of working has become a spent force, um, then it's time to kind of start to reconsider how to use those rules and when to, and if it's time to start breaking them or altering them in order to kind of keep pollinating your own creative instinct.
It seems maybe the trick is to sort of like have a good sort of intuition or internal compass there. So you kind of know, you kind of have to have a good, I suppose, not system necessarily, but a good sort of like way to check in with your process.
And I think your own art is such a great compass for that. It if you're finding that it's starting to become repetitive and formulaic,
Or if you're bored.
or if you're bored,
Yeah.
yeah, then that's a good place and time to start questioning whether those rules are still necessary.
So back to the road trip. You said you did 34 states, is that right?
Yeah, the original plan was to do all 50, and to have the book be a kind of a portrait of America as a whole. But COVID intervened, and then fatherhood after COVID. So I got through 34, but 34 turned out to be more than enough to create like a full-scale book. So
So what were some sort of some big takeaways from that journey, from that trip? Were there some things that you discovered that you hadn't set out to discover?
I think the first takeaway was that I had thought that each hotel would be a kind of a representation of the regional character of the place that it was set, and that a hotel in Oklahoma would have something inherently Oklahomian about it versus a hotel in LA versus a hotel in New York. And that the book, when seen in sequence, you would feel like even though you weren't seeing uh, America from outside the hotel room windows, You're only experiencing America through these interiors. But because of that quality of each hotel being a representation of its own region, you would have this sense that you were journeying through America state by state. And that just completely went out the window. Because if that ever did exist, it's just the hotel industry does not operate that way now. You know, hotels have really become homogenous and uh, they all kind of aspire to have a very similar kind of look because they're all in competition with each other. So it's very hard uh, to find unique places and places that have character. And when they do have character, it's really the character of the people that own and operate the hotel and whatever their interest is versus any kind of representation of a regional culture, you know. Um, Photographers are obsessed with uh, this term called vernacular culture, which just means like local culture, you know. And like, you know, traditional photographers like Walker Evans would travel the country and they would look, you know, they document the vernacular culture of the places that they visited. Um, and yeah, that's no longer the case with the hotel room industry by and large. So that was the first surprise. I think the second surprise was that I thought that the project could be a really interesting way for me to explore this adopted country of mine, America. Um, again, through my own kind of authorship, through my own decision of where to go, you know, so like, oh, I'd love to go to like Salem, Massachusetts. I'd love to go to, uh, you know, uh, Green Bay, Wisconsin, you know, just places that I've always wanted to visit, or maybe places that I thought of as being iconic with parts of American culture. And then the project would take me there and I can make the work there. But those places didn't often, or I would say frequently, didn't have hotels that were interesting. Um,
So it's mostly like Motel 6 and whatever
yeah,
chain
or like
hotels,
Hilton.
Hilton's, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, places that, you know, which I've done, I've stayed in some of them, but you know, it's like they're not that interesting and I don't want the project to have the same kind of furniture and the same kind of interiors repeated over and over again. So to make a long story short, the hotels, finding the interesting hotels wherever they happened to be within the states that I was visiting became the itinerary. And that was curious because it took me to parts of the country that I would never otherwise visit or even know about. And in a way, that was better than going to, you know, kind of the places that I had in my mental roadmap.
Well, I like that this sort of this trip changed and your sort of work changed as a result of, right? Like it's sort of like you had one thing in your mind and then you had to change tack and then go this other sort of direction. The whole itinerary of the trip changed because of just the quality of work that you were after, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And it was a really nice way to kind of get off the beaten track and, you know, like discover parts of this country that um, aren't as well known as others. You know, like I ended up in a place called Eureka, Arkansas, which um, is up in the mountains, and it was a a vacation destination at the turn of the century because they have these natural hot springs there. And then it fell on hard times, and all of the hotels closed down. And recently, like in the last 20 years, it's kind of had a revival, and some of these older hotels reopened. And it was so fascinating being there and learning about this and being in this tiny little town in the middle of this very mountainous region that I would never otherwise find myself in or even know about.
I'm sure you had some very interesting some interesting exchanges with the people there, right?
I
And
did.
just in all these places too.
I did. Yeah. I was talking to this woman at the hotel there. Um, and we had gotten into this discussion about sort of spirituality. Because Eureka has this very like spiritual community quality to it because the hot springs, but also there's a lot of like canyons and natural rock crystals. And I had mentioned to her that this um, woman named Dolores Cannon, who was a mystic and who channeled uh, this alien personality called Seth, uh, lived in like and died in the next town over, only like 40 miles away or something, and the woman at the front desk instantly got
Right, Seth Speaks. Yeah.
what's yes,
Seth
Seth
Speaks.
Speaks,
I've
exactly.
read that.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's
It's
great.
like fascinating. They're
Yeah.
fascinating books,
Yeah.
um, what's great is that he speaks with a lot of humor. Um, so I mentioned this to her, and she instantly froze up because it turns out she had discovered Jesus. And so in her kind of mysticism, Dolores Cannon was really channeling a demonic
So she
energy.
knew of this book.
She knew
Sh
of Dolores Cannon. She knew of
Yeah.
this book. She did not approve. And she said, "Oh, well, yes, you can go there, but I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, whatever she was channeling was not holy, you know. You have to channel the Lord, and if you're not channeling the Lord, you're channeling some other entity that's going to manipulate you." I was like, "I'm in Arkansas. This is awesome."
Yeah, yeah, you get the full experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you have a lot of just like what like memorable exchanges with people? I'm sure you made a lot of you because you're there on your own. I'm sure were people generally willing to talk to you and share stuff about the area, about their lives, and so on.
People that weren't working in um, chain hotels where they had some contractual agreement with the umbrella corporation that prevented them from speaking, people that were like in the mom and pop hotels were um, really friendly and really, for the most part, really happy to talk. And I ended up collecting so many of these stories um, that I decided to include them as part of the book. And so there's a whole section in the back uh, where it's just stories that I heard from people about the hotel industry, about things they discovered in the rooms, about their experiences, and also stories of my experience just sort of traveling. But they're kind of journal entries that incorporated a lot of that those like really fascinating anecdotes that I would hear from people.
Yeah, that's really good. I was when I was reading that, I was reading some of those, and I was sort of reminded of was it Steinbeck who wrote Travels with Charlie?
Yes, exactly.
And I love those. You think about those moments, right? Like there's the trip, but it's really like the things that stand out in your mind is like some the people that he'd met.
Yeah.
Like it seems like that sort of like just in general, we're very people oriented, right? So it's like that is a I assume that was a big part of your trip.
It didn't start out that way. Um, and then when I realized that that could be an interesting component, both for me and my experience of the trip, but also for a potential reader of the book, it really became like I started to look for it. It became a big part of what I was doing, was kind of just asking questions and being nosy and getting into weird conversations with people and you know, sometimes just asking them directly, like, what's the weirdest thing that's ever happened here? You know, just out of my own curiosity.
Can you share anything that can you share a story of that?
The by far the weirdest story and the most fascinating one was from a hotel that I wasn't even staying at. I was in Sturgis, South Dakota, which has the famous motorcycle rally, and I was just photographing the facade of this hotel that I had driven by. And the owner came out to ask me what I was doing, and when I explained to her, she was at first she was sort of nervous and I think just unsure why there was a strange man photographing her hotel. But then I explained and we got to talking and she told me this story that didn't happen to her, but it happened to a close friend of hers who she's still in contact with. And this woman and her daughter uh, went to Reno, Nevada The woman was there for like a business conference, and she was staying at a very nice hotel, and she decided to bring her daughter just to have like a bonding experience for the weekend. And they were staying at this hotel, and they noticed that there was an odd odor in the room uh, for the first night that they were there. So they called the hotel, and they complained, and the hotel said that they'd bring the maid up to disinfect and to clean when they were away. So they went off for the day. They came back. It seemed like the room smelled good after they came back. They went to sleep. And in the middle of the night, this odor started to come back, and it came back really, really strong. And so they went down in the morning and they complained, and they said, listen, this is getting unusually pungent. Uh, can you please do something about it? So the hotel sent a whole crew of uh, cleaners uh, and maids up to the room to investigate. And during their process of like disinfecting and cleaning and wiping, they discovered that there was a dead body under the mattress. And when I
Oh,
say, yeah, and when I say under the mattress, I don't mean like under the bed. I mean that under the mattress is the box spring. And somebody had cut out a shape of a body out of the box spring and then had put the dead body, the corpse, into that cutout and then put the mattress on top so that the body was actually like sandwiched between the box spring and the mattress in the way that you kind of like hide a knife or a gun in the pages of a book
right,
in
right,
like old-timey
right.
movies.
Yeah.
Like that's what they did with this corpse. And then
Oh,
like
it's
they put it in there and then left. And this poor woman and her daughter were sleeping on top of this thing
oh,
for
that's
the
so
night.
gnarly. That's so gnarly. Oh, that's so gross. Oh
Just,
man. Well,
just
I'm glad
so
nothing like
awful,
that happened to you on your trip.
as far as I know. And here's the kicker. So they uh apparently there was a woman that was renting this hotel room for like 2 weeks with her partner. It was her and this man. They were a couple, and they would have these like explosive arguments, like just like yelling at each other at the top of their lungs for 2 weeks. And people like their neighbors would complain, and the manager would have to go up there and tell them to pipe it down and threaten them with eviction. And then eventually the arguing stopped. And then a day or two later, the woman just left. And
Oh man.
so either she, killed this guy or she had an accomplice. Like nobody really knows.
Wow.
This all
Wow.
happened before the internet. And so there was no way um, for this woman to follow up and to figure out what the woman telling me the story to follow up to figure out what happened. But yeah, she's still friends with the person that experienced this, and this poor woman still has nightmares about it. Sleeping on top of a corpse for 2 days
Yeah.
in a hotel.
Well, I look at your work and I think about hotels being a place of possibility, both for good or ill. I think there's a real sort of openness
Mhm.
to that, right? Like you talk about in the book, hotels being places of mystery or transgression or possibility or there's like a hopefulness too. So it seems like it's really like a blank canvas for
Yeah, they're
you.
really fascinating for that. I kind of think of them as almost like, if countries could be said to have a subconscious, the hotel would be that place, you know? Like I think about all of the like movies that have had hotels as settings, like The Shining or David Lynch, or I mean, it goes on and on. Or even like the way artists and musicians have used hotels as studios. Um, and I think part of that is because they're really um, in between spaces, which kind of goes back to that original point of them being like portals between worlds. They're really like a space between the public and the private. And because you're renting it and everything's going to be cleaned up after you leave. I think it gives you a sense of being disinhibited. Um, and and being able to like live in a kind of an alternate zone that's outside the zone that is the purely private zone that you have at home with your family, or the purely public zone that you experience when you go out into the real world and you have to live by the rules and conditions that are set for you in whatever region you live in. It's like it's its own thing, and I think that's why, you have all this like weird activity that happens in hotels like drug deals and prostitution. Um, but also they're places for romantic escapes and fantasies and travel and leisure. Um, and so they just, they represent such a wide gamut.
Yeah, yeah. Or like
Uh,
in your case as a kid, like starting a new life, right?
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So you came from the Soviet Union in the mid 80s, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Mid 80s.
Yeah. Yeah, so that seemed like that was like the doorway. That was like the doorway to this country of opportunity and so forth.
Yes. It was like it was the cultural visa checkpoint between our old Russian life and our new American life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So when you were a kid in Russia, what kind of were you looking at art or were you drawing? Well, I assumed you knew you wanted to be an artist from an early age.
I did. I was always drawing.
Yeah.
I was always doodling. Um, and we had some art books in our apartment. Um, and I don't really have clear memories of this, but like my mom tells me how I would just be at the kitchen table drawing all day, listening to the radio. Um, so I think there was always kind of that creative bug was there from a very early age.
So you mentioned you started drawing and painting again more recently, right?
Yes, yes. Especially now that it's a good time to do it because, as I said, being a new dad, I'm unable to travel to make this work. So it's actually been nice being in the studio and kind of rediscovering drawing and painting. Mostly drawing. I haven't really gotten back into painting, but I've been working on a new series of drawings.
So how has being a father influenced your work?
Great question. Um, I had heard so many people talk about how fatherhood, um, how it made them less selfish, and it had all of these like amazing benefits on their personality. And I kind of kept waiting for that to happen, but I'm still like the same selfish, like incredibly selfish human being I always have been. Um, I think I've just you end up learning how to um, control it, how to put your selfishness on a shelf, how to shelve it. That's the word. That's the way to say it. How to shelve your selfishness um, when because you have to be in service. You have to be in service to your family and your child. Um, I think it's amazing discovering that you have a capacity for love at at a level that was unimaginable prior to having a child. Um, it's incredible watching sort of the miracle of a child growing up and to kind of realize that like, oh yeah, it actually is like life is a miracle, you know? And so kind of entering into this like newfound state of wonder. And I think the last thing I'd say about it is like when you have a child, it gives you a chance to have a second childhood because now you're having a childhood vicariously through them. And so it gives you this very interesting second bite at the apple, um, where you can experience a kind of a dual consciousness, a consciousness of the child seeing it through your child's eyes, but yet at the same time having the experience of the adult and having those two things in dialogue with each other. And To answer your question, sorry, more directly, I'm not sure what effect it's had on my work yet. I think
It
it's still
sounds
early.
it sounds like as a person though, it's had a profound effect on your just your thinking and your way of moving about the world.
Yeah, I think it's an ongoing process. They change so quickly. Um, and every time you think you've caught up, they've transformed into and they've into something else, into a new creature, in the best possible sense. You're It's kind of like what we were saying, like the rules of the game keep getting altered almost on a weekly basis. Um, and that in itself is kind of a wonderful place to be.
It seems like it's very healthy to have that. And I've noticed that we go back a long time now. I feel like I've known you what over 10 years.
Yeah, I feel like right?
I don't remember who said this. They were talking about Jack Lemmon's performance in The Apartment, that movie, which I've never seen that movie, but I just like this quote that someone said that he never changes in the movie, he just evolves.
Mm,
And so I feel like for you, it's the same. It's like you're still the same, but you've evolved. And I think that's it. I'm sure fatherhood is a big part of that, but and also as we age, we change. You know, like one tends to change. Hopefully for the best. In your case, certainly. But it's been cool seeing your work evolve too. And it seems like you've come to the place where you're working on things a little more slowly.
mm.
Um, so maybe you could talk about the drawings you've been doing. They're a little more, they're, would you call them, um, like how could you just, how would you describe some of the new drawings you're making now?
Well, I think being a father to a toddler um, has absolutely made me a more patient human being. And anybody that has a toddler will instantly know what I'm talking about. Um, and as a result, I think that's made these drawings possible. And the drawings are just, they're graphite on paper. Um, and they're just very, very kind of slow, meticulous, kind of shading. Uh, they're drawings of clouds. They're landscape based. And I think the basic idea is sort of with the hotel work, one of the things that really drew me to it is that um, it's kind of a limited vocabulary of objects. It's like desks and chairs and couches and beds. And so it's like what are like kind of the most interesting and infinite variety of ways that I can rearrange a finite and limited number of objects. Um, and I kind of treat the drawings the same way. That's like I use a very finite vocabulary of shapes. There's like a cloud shape and there's a kind of a gradient, and there are these rope shapes, and sun shapes and sometimes airplane shapes. And so it's almost like using almost like stencils or vocabulary. Uh, and then what are the most the largest variety of ways in which I can just deploy this limited variety of shapes, which kind of goes back to what we're learning about nature, which is that it's sort of this fractal universe, that only has like this limited variety of kind of phenomena. There's shapes like the branching shape, which seems to uh, be everywhere. There's the spiral. Um, I think there's like six or seven basic kind of elements that just get repeated throughout the universe on both the tiniest scale and the largest scale. And um, and that's kind of how the drawings have evolved, is kind of developing a limited vocabulary of these shapes and then starting to deploy them in various ways.
That's good. So, do you have a meditation practice? You still do?
I do, yeah. Yeah, I try to meditate twice a day,
Yeah.
kind of in the mornings and then in the early afternoon.
What kind of meditation?
You know, I've kind of tried a bunch of different things, and now it's this kind of Frankenstein hybrid monster of several techniques as well as things that I've kind of developed for myself that are useful. But it's kind of a little bit of Vipassana and a little bit of transcendental meditation and a little bit of my own kind of weird self-hypnosis style meditation.
That's right. You introduced me to Vipassana. You were the one who got me into Vipassana initially.
Yes.
You recommended I do the 10-day course, which I did. And I was thinking of you during that course because you said, "Oh, it's easy. It's fine. It's not you'll be
Did I
fine."
say that? Oh my God, I
You
lied so
said
badly to
that. It's
you.
such a lie.
I'm so
Yeah.
sorry. I
No,
didn't realize that.
I'm glad you said. At the time I was like, "Alex," but I probably wouldn't have gone if you were like, "Oh man, it's like the hardest thing." And it is, the first one is like the hardest thing you ever do. It's so hard. It's like, but then you go, multiple the times, every time I've gone since has been relatively easy. I mean, it's never easy, but the first time, there's nothing like that. You know how I didn't know. Like every time I would go to the hall, I would be just like, I would leave there just covered in sweat, just like
Yeah.
you're just, it's such a battle. But
How many times have you been now?
definitely served two, and I sat, I think four, maybe now, four or five, maybe more. I don't know. I was going every year from like 2017, 2018, 2019. Did
Mm,
one in 2020, and then the past couple years I served in 2020. I can't quite remember, maybe four or five. And then a
yeah.
couple of shorter courses. You can do a 3-day course after you do the 10-day.
Yep.
But I've gotten a lot out of serving too, because you sort of like, that's kind
Okay.
of how life is, and I'm sure it's the same way when you have a child and you're meditating and you gotta like go do something crazy. You gotta, yeah, like in life you're not you're in a bubble, but you're not in that kind of bubble where you can just meditate for days on end. And serving is a little more accurate, a little more applicable to life, I would say, where you still meditate the 3 hours a day with the three required periods, but then you're like cooking and you're talking to people and you're dealing with stuff in the kitchen, you're doing other stuff, you're having to come back to the practice after these sort of distractions. So it's more difficult to kind of get like in the zone, you might say, but it's maybe more useful.
Would you ever do the 30-day retreat? I think they do those, right? They
They
do
do
it.
the 30-day. Yeah, they got 20-day, 30-day, 60-day. I would do. Yeah, I would do. I'm sure I would do a 30-day. I think there's a lot of benefit, but I guess the question is just taking that much time off, right? Getting the time, but it's
But is
useful.
it that much time off, right? When you think about the grand
Yeah,
arc of your life, 30 days within that context is nothing, right?
absolutely. That's exactly right. Yeah, especially 10 days. People say,
Yeah.
"Yeah, I'd go, but I can't take the 10 days off." It's like, do you remember what you did 10 days ago?
Hmm?
Like, what did you really do? But I guarantee you're going to remember this retreat if you go.
Yes, right.
That's a
10,
10
it's
day.
like 10, it's like 10 years of psychotherapy
Oh
condensed
yeah.
in a 10-day experience.
Yeah, yeah, it's really, I think that's why the first one is so difficult compared to the subsequent ones, because you're really, there's a real barrier there, there's a real wall. But at the same time, I remember a lot of spaces opened up in terms of you just see the world, I guess, more clearly, perhaps. Like that's what it's about. It's called, in Vipassana just means insight. So the idea is that you're seeing things as they are.
Yeah.
And it's so difficult to do. There's so many screens, so many different filters, I should say, in life. Most of it is like, I want it to be like this, I don't want it to be like that, and then you're of course influenced by the culture around you. And we live in a very extremely consumerist culture, which, it's not all bad. I mean, there's a lot of great things, a lot of great amenities to that, but it can be difficult because we're focused on the material world.
I think it was Kierkegaard, I think, I'm pretty sure it was, that said that all of man's problems can be uh, can be traced down. Can basically all of man's problems result from the fact that uh, from his inability to sit quietly in a room by himself and do nothing.
I love that. I love
And,
that.
and yeah, for me, uh, it's all of those material things, but it's also like the way that they distract the mind, right? It's like when you stop the input, when you unplug yourself from the input that the world is constantly feeding you, and um, and then you kind of detox from that inflow of information, which takes about like 3 or 4 days. It's kind of like going on a diet. When you stop eating,
Yeah.
eventually your body, well, first your body freaks out and it sends you all the hunger signals, which panic your brain. And you think, I'm dying, I need a sandwich. And then it kind of stops sending you those signals because it realizes it won't be rewarded and it recalibrates itself. Um, and then it goes into a place of kind of like homeostasis, and then it slowly starts to eat itself. It starts to use its own reserves for energy. And the same thing happens mentally. It's like you stop this fucking input of this constant stream of information. Your brain freaks out, you panic, then you calm down, and then there's this moment of freedom where you're emptied and you can then like look and examine and think about your own life and look at your old storehouse, right? You start eating yourself mentally, but in a good way. You start looking at your memories, your experiences, your thoughts, but all without the interruption and the distraction of new input.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Otherwise,
start
otherwise you
processing
can't.
through it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You can't burn through the old stuff, right? If you keep putting new stuff, you can't really process it. You can't.
absolutely. It's the same with dieting, right? Yeah, it's like you can't, you know, it's like you're just mentally, it's the new movie, it's the new book, it's the new conversation, it's all that stuff, and it's all great. It's all great to have those experiences, but they, how I have to question myself, even to this day, I have to question like how much of what I do, even as an artist, is me being truly an artist, and how much in the sense of like me being inspired and compelled to make work for the pure reason of wanting to create, and how much of it um, is me distracting myself from whatever trauma, whatever insights, whatever things I'm going through internally, you know. And sometimes it's a bit of both, you know. But that
Yeah.
element of wanting to distract myself from some uncomfortable truth is it's it's always there, you know.
And I guess you have to also think about like how are we consumers, not just of materials and things, but information, and how are we consumers of experience, even experience, like all that stuff we're consuming something, but
Yeah.
maybe it's sort of a function or a form of running away from things that are uncomfortable.
I think that's why they call it, your uncomfortable truths or uncomfortable realities.
Yeah. Yeah.
No
But you gotta
better
face
way.
those. It feels so good to face it, right? To
Yeah,
be with it and not run away from it. And you see what happens. I think we get into so much trouble with addiction, with negativity and all these bad habit patterns because we're just afraid to sit there by ourselves in a quiet room
and do nothing.
and do nothing. Yeah.
Well, I have an avoidant personality when it comes. I'm like conflict avoidant for sure.
I think we all do though. I think we all try to run away from things that are uncomfortable and towards things that are pleasurable.
And it's a fine line to make sure that your meditation, it doesn't become another form of escape from the uncomfortable truths of your life, because it is easy to become a enlightenment chaser, you know, rather than like a seeker of just the truth of who you are.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like there is a kind of a spiritual materialism perhaps that you could
Yeah.
easily fall into with meditation, with plant medicines. I think it stems from thinking that there's like, and I remember doing this when I was doing a lot of, and I should thank you for this too. You got me into my first medicine ceremony, and so I greatly appreciate you got me into that, which led to a whole lot of positive changes. Then that led me to meditation and so on and so forth. So I really am quite grateful for that. And just for your friendship, I want to say this before it slips away that I'm grateful for your friendship through the years. But
Same,
having these,
same here.
thank you. So I would go to these groups and then I would have these thoughts like, I just want to stay here. You know, you're really deep in the medicine and you're feeling so good and you have this oneness with the universe, and that's a beautiful thing. But you don't want to like leave there and then go about your regular life and think that that's the reality. You know, like I should say these exalted states are a little dangerous because they can be traps. You know, really right now, every moment is the exalted state. Every moment is beautiful. And when you start to establish a hierarchy, then you create this sort of foundation for suffering, I think.
Yeah, that's such a great point because it is um, the experience of the heightened state is ultimately like the main way that we can distract ourselves from what's uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's like you don't have to, you're just there. You don't have to worry about anything. Your whole life is just, you know, all the stuff that you didn't deal with, whatever. You just shrug it off because, you know, right in that
And
moment.
I, totally. And I'm so bad with that. Like I'll notice that I'll have just like not even things that are uncomfortable, just like chores that I need to do. Like, oh, I got to pay this bill and I go online and do this and organize that. And I know I need to do it. Or I could draw for a couple of hours.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's
Like I'll just go draw for a couple of
there's
hours.
there's there's definitely a balance there too, though, because I think sometimes when you leave that stuff hanging and have something that you have to do and you're in the studio, then the work becomes a little more urgent. Like, okay, well, there's stuff I'm not doing that I should be doing, so I'm just gonna really like put more into this thing. I don't know if you felt that.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. And I think again, I keep bringing it back to fatherhood, but when you have a child and your time becomes so much more precious because you're like there's all these new commitments, um, then those decisions become really crucial. You know, it's like, well, I can kind of figure out a way maybe to pay those bills and to do that stuff, or administrative stuff, um, late at night or on the train or in the waiting room at the doctor's office. But I can't do that. I can't make art that way. So if I have a couple of hours now where I can make a drawing or work on something, then I'm going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it
Feel better.
becomes right. So it becomes more urgent. So maybe it's not necessarily that you're being a father has like you're not making like the the kind of work you're making hasn't necessarily changed, but it's more the urgency or the you realize your time, the quality of your time has changed.
I think so for sure. I think so. And but I think the kind of work has I think it's changed as well. Um,
But it seems like it's related to time. Like you've been spending more longer and longer on these drawings, and you're really putting a lot of effort into maybe a singular piece. Which actually, I wanted to ask you about this. We talked in your studio not long ago about durability in the art world, and I'd mentioned I just like thinking about that word. I was talking about going to a painting show and sort of realizing all this all this stuff. Not to throw any shade on contemporary art, but so much work. I mean, just you see out there is going to be in a dumpster in like, I mean, at 5 years at best, you know, like, I mean, not necessarily out there, but so much stuff that's being made is almost like just being produced just to be thrown away, you know, like, and how do you think about durability as it relates to
you know,
time?
it's a great question, and I think it goes back to um, earlier in the conversation. We were talking about these like words that are used pejoratively to describe certain kinds of work. or styles of work, decorative or illustrative or precious. And for me, those words are much less helpful than the idea of flimsiness versus durability. Like ultimately, it doesn't matter to me if something is illustrative or whether it's decorative or precious. Like it could be precious and be incredible, right? It's more about whether something just is flimsy, and it's hard to define flimsiness. Um, it's really just something that you kind of feel when you're looking at something, and it's also hard to define durability in a certain sense because you don't really know for sure what will last and what last the test of time and what won't. Um, but the more I think about it, the more I've kind of just tried to frame the experience of looking at work in that way. And the experience of making my work in that way is like really thinking about like making work that's durable, making work that um, has something that may be experienced 10 years or 20 years or 30 years from now or and still be vital. And of course, you know, it's impossible to fully control that because we don't know what will happen. But you can control your own rigor in making the work in the present moment, um, and whether or not it's something that's going to be durable for you versus being flimsy for you.
That's good.
And so, with these drawings, I'm approaching them almost like old master drawings, just taking my time and really um, putting in a certain amount of focus and labor and concentration um, to breathe a kind of a durable life into them, um, so that there's something that can be enjoyed, at least for me, even if I'm the only person to enjoy them. But it's something that I could return to over and over and over again, and it becomes an inexhaustible experience as opposed to something that has that like quick hit. Um, it, kind of reminds me, not to go on too long about it, but there's this great story, and I think it was one of Malcolm Gladwell's book, and I forget if it was The Tipping Point or Thin Slicing, but he talked about how taste tests were making a lot of taste tests came back, and during when Coke and Pepsi were having their battle, a lot of taste tests came back and were saying that people preferred Pepsi to Coke. And the reason was that Pepsi was a little sweeter. And so Coke came out with this product called New Coke, which was even sweeter than Pepsi. And they did a bunch of taste tests. And sure enough, between Coke and Pepsi and New Coke, people overwhelmingly preferred New Coke. And so they rolled out this product with great fanfare and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising. And it was an absolute disaster to the point where it is now studied in marketing and business schools as one of the greatest corporate catastrophes of a product of all time because they sunk so much money into it and it was so uh, uniformly and unequivocally rejected by consumers. And when they did the postmortem on why that happened, it turned out that the way the taste tests are structured is you get like this little 1 ounce shot of the product and you drink it and then you have a reaction. Um, but people don't consume soda that way in a one shot in a one shot quantity. They drink an entire 12-ounce can. And when you're drinking, you have this thing that's very sweet. And when you're just taking one shot, the sweetness, is pleasant. But when you're forced to drink an entire 12-ounce can of something that sweet, it actually is kind of revolting. So I kind of think of art in the same way, we're like so used to these like visual sound bites of things, and we go to openings and we look at work and it's very quick and things appear on Instagram. Um, but ultimately, you want to make work that can survive a much larger sample, a much larger tasting.
That's a really great point, and then that sort of shines a light on how our perceptions of durability aren't necessarily always accurate. And I think the best we can really do is think about how we might perceive our own work in the future. Like, is this something, am I making something that I will like? I mean, we should always have that as the foremost in our minds of, is this something that I want to make? But
Yeah.
is this something that I will perceive as being good or interesting in the future, which is very difficult, even for ourselves, right?
Yeah, yeah, you're right. It's a hard line to tread because of course, like who knows, who knows how things will be viewed or what kind of historical or visual conventions will be active in the future versus now. Um, so it's hard to prognosticate that with any degree of certainty. But at the same time, I just think, I kind of think that art is this, it's kind of like making a work of art is kind of like making a battery, you know? And then your focus and concentration and intention and effort is the way that you charge that battery. And when those things are come from an authentic place, um, then that battery can get a really good, powerful charge. And you see that, like you see like a Hans Holbein painting, you know, it's like 500 years and later after he's made them. And that's still like a really well-functioning battery. Like I could plug into that thing and get so much out of it, 500 years on. And so if you can make that, if you can do that, why wouldn't you? Which doesn't mean that you paint like Hans Holbein or that you draw like Leonardo da Vinci. It just means that you have to invent your own method of creating that battery, whatever it is. Um, but um, but that's sort of what I mean by durability is like it's going to be a battery that will have an almost infinite capacity to give energy to posterity.
It's a
And if
great way to
that,
put it.
yeah,
Yeah, like you look at like I've been really on this like Northern Renaissance kick lately, like Hans Memling and
yeah, me too.
these yeah. Oh man,
I was just looking at the Grunwald altarpiece, just like geeking out on it.
oh the which one?
Sorry, not the
Oh,
The
the Ghent
Eisenheim altar,
Ghent altarpiece by
Yeah,
Van Eyck.
no, the Eisenheim altarpiece by
Oh, Grunwald.
Grunwald.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's a gnarly. That's like metal. That's that
it's
thing.
like metal.
Whoa.
That's a great way to describe it.
I'm doing a trip this summer to see a lot of these northern. I'm going to uh Belgium and Amsterdam and London, and but there's a lot of great. I mean, we're gonna go to Ghent to see the Ghent altarpiece by Van Eyck.
Yeah, oh,
Like that's whoa,
that's
that
amazing.
stuff just you're in another dimension. They're just on a painting level, like you can there's so many layers and there's so much richness to it. I in my sort of obviously biased opinion, it's to me it's that's kind of like the pinnacle of Western art, of Western painting.
Yeah, and there's so much to that. Like um I was looking at specifically the way Christ's hands are depicted in the Grunwald when he's crucified. They're like these knobby branches of a dead tree. Like they have this like really expressive, interesting quality to them, but they really echo that like dead tree quality. And then when he's resurrected and he's coming out of this incredible, almost like mushroom cloud of light, his hands are like flowers. They're like these like beautiful, like elegant, like flower-like teardrop shapes. And they're completely unnatural. Like you actually can't do what he's doing with this. You can't like make your fingers look like that. So it was like very intentional to make them look flower-like in that design.
That's amazing. I'm yeah, I'm just looking at it right now. It's just oh man. Yeah, there is something quite, I suppose, I don't want to say mystical necessarily about that kind of work, because everything really, could be. I think it's all sort of tapping, if you're tapping into this, the creative, the source, if you will, right? What Rick, I think Rick Rubin calls it the source, right?
Yeah.
Have you read Creative Act?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
quite good. But I feel like if you're doing it right, you're tapping into this thing and sort of transcends, maybe it transcends time,
Yeah.
like the best stuff, the stuff that we're talking about, 500, 600 years old, or even ancient, even cave, even some of these cave paintings, it could, I mean, it still seems as fresh as when it was made in a sense.
You're so right. And the connection is startling because it's still so direct. I think when people look at, those Lascaux cave paintings, they're um, shocked, not because they're looking at a photographic representation, but because it's still so relatable. There's still something that like touches you to your core. It's kind of like when you are at the zoo and you make eye contact with a gorilla and you're like, oh my God, there is this connection there between myself and um this animal that's so different and specific and beautiful than like the connection that you have when you're looking at a dog, you know. Um the, it's pretty, yeah, those things are pretty amazing. And how art transcends time in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, you just made me think of a Meister Eckhart quote where he says, "The eye through which God sees me is the same eye through which I see God." Something like that. Something
Yeah,
to that
I think
effect.
I heard that one. That one's really good.
Yeah.
It's funny. I love we're kind of looking and reading the same stuff without realizing it. I've been geeking out on Meister Eckhart too, although I haven't yet read any of his things directly, but I've read of him and I've read about him through other people. And there's this amazing quote that I just heard that is um, that's been tumbling around in my head, which is uh, he said, "God doesn't speak to me, but every once in a while I hear him cough."
Wait, is that that was Meister Eckhart?
Yeah.
Really?
Or no,
That's
every
good.
once in a while, sorry, not cough. God doesn't speak to me, but every once in a while I hear him clearing his throat. That's what it
Hmm.
is.
That's good. That's really good. That's really good. I think it's all related. Once you get into these sort of deeper, like really looking at things, and you're looking at. I was speaking with a monk recently, a Benedictine monk, who did I tell you about this? I went to the monastery where he lives, and they do Gregorian chants, and I was asking him. It was on the last podcast. He was talking about how he got into it. He got into being a monk through music, and
Hmm.
he sort of realized that for him that the music was so good that it had to be divinely inspired. Like he was getting into like Renaissance composers and classical music like that on such a deep level. But
Hmm.
some of his advice, I think, that was really helpful was to learn how to listen to good music.
Hmm.
And I think there is kind of a skill to that or something, or not. I don't know if skill is the right word, but there really is. Like, it's almost like looking at art as an art form,
Hmm.
like getting into these like deeper, like you really get into the deeper, like the qualities of things. And then it's hard, right? It's hard to look at this stuff. That's probably why when I went to that show, that I thought I was looking at these paintings thinking they're going to be in the dumpster in a few years. Like after looking at, like you go to the Met and you're looking at Van Eyck's and Memlings and Duccio's and things like that. It's you're really looking at those and really absorbing those qualities, then you sort of see a lot of other art differently. Not necessarily always bad. I did see a couple of shows after going to the Met. I went to. Did you see the Laura Owen show that was up at Matthew
We
Marks
did,
recently?
yeah. That was great.
Beautiful. Yeah, it was really good. It was really good. That
Yeah.
was still good. I after going to the Met, then going there directly afterwards. I was pleasantly surprised that it was still a great show. So I mean, I'm, whatever you're doing, whatever it can be done now, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be, made with the same attention to
No,
craft
yeah.
as Van
Yeah.
Eyck, right? It could be a different form of expression and still be rigorous,
Yeah.
still have
Yeah.
durability to it.
Absolutely. You don't have to make Renaissance style paintings. You don't have to compose. You can do it if the spirit is the same, right? Your attention to your the care in which you produce something.
I was listening to an interview with a architectural historian who made this incredible point that I think relates to what we're talking about because it's sort of transferable to our discussion about art and its fluctuation of quality. Um, he said that for uh, hundreds and hundreds of years, there was this standard of quality in architecture, and that standard of quality was sort of codified through ways in which proportions are used and materials are used and um, concepts of where doors and roofs and windows are placed and their relationship to each other. And which meant that you didn't have to be a particularly gifted architect in order to make a really good looking building. As long as you learned what that standard was and you followed its rules, then you could construct a building that didn't have to be like particularly creative or groundbreaking, but it would function both as a really well constructed building as well as being visually very pleasing. Modernism kind of tossed a lot of that out of the window. And you had people like Mies van der Rohe that came about and started making these radical, minimalist, gorgeous, gorgeous buildings, which was a necessary development in the history of architecture. But one of the unfortunate side effects was that you threw out the standard of quality and you didn't really replace it with another standard. Um, you replaced it with this idea of the individual genius. Um, and so subsequent architects who were geniuses could make incredible buildings working in the modernist style. But the ones that weren't, that were just functional, out of school architects who were just paid professionals, no longer had a standard to make up for their lack of talent or their lack of vision. And so they would make buildings that were kind of modernist, uh, but because they weren't Mies van der Rohe, these structures just ended up looking really inhuman and um, sterile and boring and awful. And so the world got populated with all of these like really terrible buildings as a result. And it's kind of like a similar thing has happened in the art world to some extent, where, there was this like um, standard of craft that every artist needed to achieve in order to be accepted as an artist. Uh, and if you achieved that standard of craft, it didn't matter if you weren't particularly visionary or original. You can paint a beautiful painting of a bouquet and it would hang in someone's house. You could paint a scene from the Bible. And that got tossed out, and thank God it did, because sort of not everyone needs to be shackled to that or judged by that. But as a result, um, you got the world got replaced by uh, people that seemingly made these spontaneous, beautiful works of art, like Picasso and Matisse and de Kooning and Pollock, um, and the subsequent generation of artistic aspirants looked at that um, and said, "Yeah, well, I want to do something like that. I want to make something exciting. I want to make something that kind of looks like that." And so, yeah, you can do that, and you can kind of parrot some of that stuff or parrot the attitude with which those works are made. Um, but unless, if you don't have the chops of those original guys, it's kind of like the talentless architect who's working outside of the architectural, historical canon and is making like really bad like Mies van der Rohe buildings that are like just, you know, look really terrible and inhuman. Anyway, it just to me
Yeah.
it was an interesting way of looking at things that I hadn't considered before.
Yeah, I think also accessibility is part of it in terms of like everybody has access to the whole canon of Western art pretty much. You can see everything. And so and contemporary anybody can go out there and which is I mean everything is not necessarily good or bad in and of itself. You so many people gain so much from having access to this, but also there's a lot more that's being produced that I don't want to make a too harsh a judgment that is but maybe questionable quality and intention, you know.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also because the idea of craft has been so disparaged. It's another one of those terms like decorative or illustrative. Or now the idea of craft has now become this like a terrible four-letter word that people don't want to be associated with. Um, but there's nothing wrong with craft. There's nothing wrong with being a master of the craft that's inherent in whatever medium, whatever mode of working that you're involved with. In fact, it's a good thing. It should be celebrated, but no
Yeah.
one aspires to that anymore. Partly because it takes too long and everyone is under so
Yeah.
much pressure to make a ton of work and to make it really poppy and to get it out into the world.
It's interesting you mentioned that about there's a reaction you see that in like the Atelier movement, like a reaction against this
Mhm.
de-skilled art world, is that there's
Mm,
this group of people that focus only on that. And in fact, I know somebody who associated. He's a part of that sort of group. A group he's a part of one of the schools. He went to an academy, and he doesn't consider himself to be an artist,
mm.
which is interesting. So it's like the other way around. So you see all these like there's like reaction against that. It's like we want to make things that are beautiful. We're just craftspeople. We're not trying to be individuals in that same way. We're not trying to sort of expand any sort of
Yeah.
we're not trying to come up with new ideas. We just want to like keep these traditions. So, but I think there's a happy place. There's a place in between, right? I personally would like to have a high level of craft, but I guess a voice, if you will, or at least a sort of like a perspective, right? That is, I don't want to say unique, but that is sort of informed by your own experience and that it's genuine, that's honest.
And it occurs to me that that pendulum tends to swing quite frequently in history. There's these expansion and contraction. You have um, a period like the Renaissance goes into mannerism, which starts to look really, really wacky. And then you have a return to kind of realism with people like Velázquez and Ribera, who are like almost photographic. And in fact, there's this wonderful story of Peter Paul Rubens going to um, the Spanish court and making a painting of portraits of the king and the queen and leaving and being called back because those portraits were deemed not realistic enough, you
Mm.
know. Um, or then, you have like the pre-Raphaelites and
Oh,
the way,
like Bouguereau and people
yeah,
like that. Yeah.
yeah, all those guys.
Yeah, it was like they didn't know if it was going to be Cézanne or Bouguereau. Like who's gonna be the big movement now? No, you say Bouguereau, people are like who? Who's that? I mean, they were
All
beautifully
right, you got a
crafted.
little Bouguereau on
Yeah,
your
you got a Bouguereau.
upper lip. No, no, the artist. We're talking about the
Yeah,
artist. Oh no.
yeah. But Cézanne, I mean, but look at a Cézanne. Come on. I mean, it
Pretty wonderful stuff.
it is
Pretty
wonderful stuff.
Yeah, and again, I mean, so just in the way that those more experimental, adventurous, avant-garde movements can go too far in a certain sense and really um, become an inside baseball kind of thing. Those returns can go too far too, and they can become like really stifling and dead,
Yeah.
and you know.
We're such a we're such a reactionary species, right? Like I I think we're always going, oh no, you see it in politics, like, oh no, not this. We go over there, we go over there. There's such extremes, and I think it's wise in one's personal life and creative life to try to cultivate a nice sort of sweet spot in the middle, or where you're not going too far one way or the other. It was Eckhart Tolle, perhaps, who said that we should respond instead of reacting.
Mm.
So, right, there's like a moment, and meditation helps a lot with this. Like, there's a moment you have an opportunity, and normally you would react. Maybe 9 out of 10 times you're still going to react, but that one time that maybe you stop and you just respond. And you can make a more healthy choice, with whatever it is. But in the studio, I think too, we can be very reactive. Oh no, I don't want to do that. I want to do this, and then you're all over the place and you're making this kind of thing, and then you're reacting to the perception of it, and you're reacting to things that you think the culture is gonna appreciate on some level. But if you can slow it down a little bit, that seems helpful.
Do you think as your practice of meditation has evolved, your work has become um, almost a form of meditation in and of itself? How they talk about like walking meditation, for instance. Could there be like a painting meditation?
I'm glad you mentioned this because often I find that like at the start of a session, of a painting session, I'm a little more agitated. And then
Mm.
when I can surrender to it, just the process, then by the end of it, I'm just like, oh, this is fine. It's fine. And then similarly, in like a meditation session, you might start off and you're kind of, agitated or at least just sort of antsy, and then by the end of it, you've settled into it. So I think there is definitely an element there.
You feel like it's um, a question of kind of awareness, a certain kind of awareness, which is maybe a different kind of awareness that you're having, that you're experiencing in day-to-day life. Um, that's at play, or does the painting then become a way of either experiencing or cultivating that awareness?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes a kind of a microcosm in a sense for your life. Like it's like a little, I guess, I mean, I feel like you're actively creating your own life. Obviously, we're in the studio, you're creating your sort of world, your universe, but in your life, I think it's the same thing. Like your consciousness is, I think it's fundamental that it's the base, and then everything else sort of springs from that, from consciousness, whatever that means.
Yeah. I sometimes think about the way uh, old Byzantine uh, monk painters would make their work, like you read about, guys like Andrei Rublev, uh, and they would, every part of the process was a kind of exercise and a sort of a meditative, spiritual experience, Before even making the painting, they would fast and they would put themselves into these like meditative trance states to purify themselves. Then they would go to the forest and select the tree based on their intuitive kind of feeling, from which then the wooden icon panel would be made. And then they would have the tree chopped down and make the icon panel. And they would be like involved in every step of the process of like uh, making the panel of gessoing or whatever they did to the wood. Um, and each one of those each one of those processes was kind of a physical manifestation of the purification of the soul that they were experiencing through their meditative practice internally. And so then the act of making the piece would then be this wonderful act of devotion. And I kind of, there's a part of me that's so like envious of that in a certain way
Yeah,
because they just had such a strong sense of the purpose that this had. They were almost like magicians, they were like creating this like mystical object, and they knew that that's what they were doing, and they knew what purpose it served in the
yeah,
world, that it was there, you know, to fulfill this very specific need for people and for the church and for the devoted. And there's just something so wonderful about that kind of, you know, uh, relationship to the practice.
Yeah, and they had to be that's really good. They had to be in this like this state. And I think you take it for granted, but like you don't really we tend not to think about it very so much, but your quality, the quality of your mental state is going to directly inform what you're doing in the studio. So it makes sense that these monks would meditate and fast and sort of be in this sort of state where they could be divinely inspired.
Yeah, and have that certainty about it, um, that certainty of purpose. Now we kind of we're making the work, um, but there isn't this like very specific reason that we're making the work in outside of ourselves, you know. Um, Whereas for them, they did have that. It in a way it had nothing to do with them.
Yeah,
It was all about the
yeah.
reason.
Yeah, I spoke with a Christian. He was a liturgical painter, Aiden Hart. Really makes beautiful stuff, but they look very much they're very much in the tradition of like icon painting and liturgical painting. You've seen very similar designs, and he was sort of saying that he's only 60 or 70 years old, but he's actually thousands of years old in a sense because he's making work in the same tradition as so many people that have come before him. You would have a lot of confidence in your practice and a lot of I could see that being very comforting rather
Yeah,
than just sort of have yeah, right?
yeah. I listened to that podcast,
Indeed.
Relish. That was
Oh,
wonderful.
thank you. Thank you for that. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. But before we go, do you have any advice or any words of inspiration for anybody who wants to live a creative and
Oh, come on, don't put
fulfilling
me
life?
on the spot
No,
like
okay,
that.
all right, all right.
I
You've
want to
already
plug some
yeah.
shows. I'll be at the Laugh
Just
Factories. I'll be at the Laugh
yeah.
Factory the week of June 25th. I'll
Should I?
be at Caroline's. I'll be at the
Yeah.
Comedy Cellar performing live July
Uh,
25th through 26th.
yeah, yeah. Should I not? Is that a silly question? And like I've been asking that. I've good. Like, but you've already given a lot of great advice and a lot of great. So I just appreciate your talking today. I'm glad we finally made this happen because you were the one that planted the seed in my mind to do this podcast.
I have been a catalyst for many things, both bad and good in your life. Things that I need to apologize for, and things that I'll accept some flowers for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, I appreciate this. You got me started on the meditation path. So, like all this stuff, and it's good stuff. And I think we're really one thing that I appreciate about you is you've always been willing to go there wherever it is to seek. You're seeking. You're really asking what it is, what it means to be an artist, what it is, what it means to be what it means to move about in the world. Where I think a lot of people just don't ask the questions. You ask the questions, so I appreciate that.
Oh, well, thanks. Thank you. Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting path. Um, and it's so nonlinear. Um, and I remember listening to an interview with someone that talked about chess and how people erroneously think that chess is like this really complicated game because it requires a lot of brain power to think of moves 20 or 30 steps ahead, but that actually is like really simple because it's linear and you understand the outcome in the moment. And because you understand what the outcome is at the end of every game, you can make adjustments to make yourself better. Whereas art is like completely nonlinear and you don't know what the outcome is. And you don't even know the quality of what you're making in relationship to the rest of the world or how it will be judged. It's like you could be like Van Gogh, like making something that you think is good, but that the world thinks is not, and then you die and then it becomes good. And there's like all of these outcomes. You just have no idea. And so because of that, it almost invites an endless amount of like mental speculation and thinking and existential kind of contemplation, which is great, which is like,
Yeah,
if you're so inclined,
yeah.
it's a wonderful
It's
place to be.
absolutely, it's really about possibility. It's like it's infinite and like you don't know. And I think there has to be a letting go of what you think the result is going to be. You have to really, it's really great and liberating. I don't want to say you have to, you don't have to do anything, but it seems very liberating and seems very freeing to focus on the process and not really think about the result because it's going to be something that's completely divorced from what you think it's going to be.
I like the idea that I will never have to retire from being an
Mm.
artist. That makes me really happy.
Yeah.
Just
Just
keep
keep
doing
doing it.
like
Exactly.
forever.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, I'll be able to finally like have the golden years of my life after I retire from my job.
There's always another thing to explore.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Dan. It's been my pleasure entirely. Thank you for doing this show and for inviting me on. It's great.
Absolutely. We'll do it again.
I look forward to it.